They laughed at her, called her a failure. But when this single mom sat at the piano, no one expected what came next. One arrogant music critic. One exhausted waitress. One moment that would silence an entire room and shatter every assumption they'd made about her. It was a bustling Friday evening, and the elegant dining room of Riverside Manor hummed with life. Located in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, this upscale venue was known for hosting everything from wedding receptions to corporate galas. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across white tablecloths, and the gentle clink of champagne glasses mixed with sophisticated laughter. In the corner, a magnificent Steinway grand piano sat waiting, polished to perfection. Among the event staff moving gracefully through the crowd was Sarah Mitchell, a 32-year-old single mother whose story was written in the tired lines around her eyes and the determined set of her shoulders. To the wealthy guests sipping their cocktails, she was invisible, just another server in a crisp white shirt and black vest, there to refill drinks in clear plates. But Sarah carried something they couldn't see, a dream that refused to die, no matter how many times life tried to bury it. Sarah's passion wasn't hospitality, it was music. Since childhood, the piano had been her sanctuary, the one place where the chaos of the world fell away and only beauty remained. She'd grown up in a small town where her mother, also a single parent, had worked herself to exhaustion to provide for 3 children. There was never money for professional lessons, but Sarah taught herself, spending countless hours at the old church piano, memorizing every piece she could find. By the time she was 16, local teachers were calling her a prodigy. She won regional competitions and earned a scholarship to a prestigious music conservatory in New York. The future seemed bright, limitless even. But life had other plans. During her sophomore year, Sarah fell in love. She got pregnant, and suddenly all those dreams of concert halls and recording studios evaporated like morning mist. Her boyfriend left before their daughter Emma was born, leaving Sarah to face the world alone. She dropped out of school and returned home, trading Chopin etudes for diaper changes and sleepless nights. 8 years had passed since then. 8 years of working double shifts, of choosing between groceries and piano sheet music, of watching her daughter grow up in a cramped apartment while Sarah pieced together a living from whatever job she could find. The event staffing work at Riverside Manor paid better than most, wealthy people tipped well, and Sarah swallowed her pride every weekend to serve champagne to people who spent more on a single dinner than she made in a month. Few people knew about Sarah's past. The other staff members knew she played piano. They'd occasionally catch her during breaks, her fingers dancing across the keys of the old upright in the employee lounge, creating beauty in stolen moments. But none of them knew about the scholarship, the competitions, the future that had slipped through her fingers like water. That particular Friday evening, the event was a retirement gala for some corporate executive Sarah had never heard of. The crowd was older, wealthier, and more self-satisfied than usual. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed freely, the atmosphere grew louder, more boisterous. That's when Marcus Beaumont made his entrance. Marcus didn't so much walk into a room as command it. A former music critic turned arts consultant, he'd built a career on his cutting reviews and sharp tongue. In his early 50s, with silver hair and an expensive suit, Marcus had the kind of presence that made people unconsciously straighten their posture. He was known in certain circles, not fondly, but prominently. His opinions could launch careers or destroy them, and he wielded that power with obvious pleasure. As Sarah refilled wine glasses at the bar, she noticed Marcus holding court near the piano, surrounded by admirers hanging on his every word. His voice carried across the room, pontificating about the decline of true artistry in modern music, about how real talent had become extinct in an age of auto-tune and mediocrity. Sarah kept her head down, focusing on her work. She'd developed a talent for invisibility, for moving through these spaces without attracting attention, without giving wealthy patrons any reason to notice her beyond the drink she served. But tonight, invisibility wouldn't save her. As Sarah approached a nearby table to clear glasses, she heard Marcus's voice rise with theatrical disdain. "That piano is wasted in a place like this," he announced loudly enough for half the room to hear. "A beautiful instrument, and I'd bet my entire collection that no one here could play it properly." "Not really." These events are full of people who think they appreciate art but wouldn't recognize true talent if it performed a private concert for them. Several guests laughed uncomfortably. Others nodded in agreement, apparently pleased to be included in Marcus's exclusive club of people who truly understood music. Sarah's colleague, Jennifer, a young woman who'd worked at the manor for years, was standing nearby. Without thinking, or perhaps thinking too much about the unfairness of it all, Jennifer spoke up. Actually, Sarah plays beautifully. She studied at the Manhattan Conservatory. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah's blood ran cold. Every head within earshot turned to look at her. She felt her face flush, her hands gripping the empty glasses so tightly she worried they might shatter. Marcus's eyebrows rose with interest, or was it amusement? Is that so? He stepped closer, examining Sarah as though she were an artifact in a museum. A conservatory student working as a waitress. How unfortunate. Tell me, dear, what happened? Couldn't handle the pressure? Realized you weren't quite as talented as you thought? The cruelty in his voice was casual, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. Several guests tittered with nervous laughter. Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor. I had other priorities, she managed to say quietly, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. Other priorities, Marcus repeated, as though tasting the words. How diplomatic. Well, since you're here and the piano is sitting idle, why don't you give us a little demonstration? Let's see if that expensive education was worth anything. It wasn't a request, it was a trap. Sarah could feel it in the expectant silence that had fallen over their corner of the room, in the way people were pulling out their phones, already anticipating something worth recording. I'm working, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. I can't just. Oh, come now, Marcus interrupted, his smile sharp. Surely you can spare a few minutes. Unless, of course, you're afraid. Stage fright can be devastating, can't it? Some people simply aren't built for performance. They crack under pressure, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. Well, perhaps a little something to be ashamed of. His companions laughed openly now, the sound like broken glass in Sarah's ears. She felt the familiar weight of shame pressing down on her shoulders, the shame of dropped dreams, of a life that hadn't turned out the way it was supposed to, of being visible when she'd worked so hard to remain unseen. She thought about Emma, probably doing homework with the babysitter right now, counting on Sarah to pay the rent, to put food on the table, to be strong enough for both of them. Every instinct screamed at Sarah to walk away, to preserve what little dignity she had left. But then something else stirred inside her, something that had been dormant for 8 years but never truly dead. It was the same fire that had kept her practicing until her fingers bled as a teenager, the same stubborn determination that had gotten her through conservatory on talent and willpower alone. She thought of Emma asking her just last week, "Mommy, why don't you play piano anymore? You used to play all the time." Sarah had deflected the question, made excuses about being tired, about the neighbor complaining about noise. But the truth was, she'd stopped playing, really playing, because it hurt too much. Because every note reminded her of everything she'd lost, everything she'd had to sacrifice. But standing here now, with Marcus's condescending smile and the crowd's expectant faces, Sarah realized something. She hadn't lost her talent. She'd set it aside to do what needed to be done, to raise her daughter, to survive. And there was no shame in that. The only shame would be in letting someone like Marcus Beaumont make her feel small. Sarah slowly set down her tray. She met Marcus's eyes, and for the first time that evening, she didn't look away. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll play." The crowd parted as Sarah walked toward the piano, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. Her heart hammered so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Behind her, she heard Marcus say something to his companions, heard their muffled laughter. They were already amused, already convinced this would be entertaining in all the wrong ways. Sarah reached the piano and stood there for a moment, looking down at the keys. How long had it been since she'd played on an instrument like this? The piano in the employee lounge was decent, but nothing like this, a concert grand Steinway, probably worth more than she'd earn in 5 years of serving champagne. She slid onto the bench, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. The room had fallen silent, waiting. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. And then she remembered why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for the competitions or the accolades, not for the scholarship or the promise of a career. She'd loved it because when she played, the world made sense. When she played, she was completely herself, no apologies, no explanations, no shame. Sarah's fingers touched the keys, and the first notes emerged soft and tentative. She chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, a piece of devastating beauty and technical difficulty, one she'd performed for her conservatory audition a lifetime ago. The opening chords were dark and powerful, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Sarah's uncertainty began to fade as muscle memory took over. Her fingers found their way across the keys with increasing confidence, and the music began to swell, filling the elegant room with raw emotion. This wasn't a performance for Marcus Beaumont or the wealthy guests watching her. This was 8 years of suppressed grief and longing pouring out through her fingertips. This was every moment she'd held Emma while she cried, every night she'd fallen asleep too exhausted to dream, every sacrifice she'd made without complaint or recognition. This was her story, translated into a language more honest than words could ever be. The music built in intensity, Sarah's hands moving with precision and passion across the keys. The technically demanding passages, the ones that had taken her months to master as a student, flowed effortlessly now, each note crystalline and perfect. But technique wasn't what moved people. It was the emotion she poured into every phrase, the lived experience that transformed notes on a page into something transcendent. The room had fallen into absolute silence. No one was laughing now. No one was whispering or checking their phones. They were transfixed, held captive by the music washing over them like a wave. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop playing. The piece moved toward its climactic section, the part where everything she'd been holding back, all the pain and beauty and struggle, came crashing together in a cascade of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music gentled. The final section was tender, almost heartbreaking in its simplicity. Sarah's fingers moved delicately across the keys, each note placed with care, like prayers whispered in the darkness. The final chord resonated through the room, hanging in the air like a question. Sarah held her hands on the keys, her whole body trembling from the emotional and physical exertion. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the room erupted. The applause started somewhere in the back and spread like wildfire through the crowd. People rose to their feet, some with tears in their eyes, their ovation thunderous and sustained. Sarah sat frozen at the piano, overwhelmed by the response, unable to process what was happening. She slowly turned on the bench and saw faces transformed by what they'd just witnessed. The superiority and boredom that had characterized the evening had been replaced by something genuine, respect, admiration, even awe. These wealthy patrons who'd barely registered her existence minutes ago were applauding her as though she were a renowned soloist at Carnegie Hall. Sarah's colleagues stood along the wall, several of them openly crying. Jennifer was beaming, clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. And Marcus Beaumont? He stood apart from the crowd, his expression unreadable. The smug confidence had vanished, replaced by something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Discomfort? Recognition? Perhaps the first genuine emotion he'd felt in years? As the applause continued, Sarah stood on shaky legs and gave a small, almost apologetic bow. She wasn't accustomed to this kind of attention, and part of her wanted to rush back to the safety of invisibility. But another part, the part that had just reconnected with her truest self, stood a little taller. As the crowd began to settle, Marcus slowly approached the piano. The room watched with anticipation, wondering what the notoriously sharp-tongued critic would say now. He stopped a few feet from Sarah, studying her with an expression that had lost all traces of mockery. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, lacking its earlier theatrical quality. That was... He paused, seeming to struggle with words for perhaps the first time in his career. That was extraordinary. Genuine artistry. The kind I was just complaining had become extinct. He looked down at his expensive shoes. I apologize for my earlier comments. They were inappropriate and presumptuous. The apology sounded painful coming from him, as though he were unaccustomed to admitting fault. Several people in the crowd exchanged surprised glances. Sarah looked at him directly, no longer intimidated. "Thank you," she said simply, without warmth or coldness. She didn't need his validation anymore. She just reminded herself of something far more important than his opinion. An older woman in an elegant gown approached, her eyes bright with emotion. "My dear, that was the most moving performance I've heard in years. Do you teach? Give concerts? How can we hear you play again?" Before Sarah could answer, others crowded around with similar questions. Business cards appeared, offers were made. A woman who owned a gallery wanted her to perform at an opening. A man who ran a concert series at the local university asked if she'd be interested in a recital. Another guest, a wedding planner, wanted to book her for events. Sarah felt dizzy from the sudden attention, the cascade of opportunities materializing out of nowhere. She accepted the business cards with gracious thanks, still processing what had just happened. Throughout the rest of the evening, everything changed. The wealthy guest who'd treated her as invisible now stopped to compliment her, to ask about her story. Tips that night were extraordinary. Several people pressed $50 and $100 bills into her hand, telling her it was the best entertainment they'd had in years. But more importantly, something had shifted inside Sarah herself. She'd spent 8 years believing that her music career had died, that she'd made an irrevocable choice between motherhood and her passion. Tonight, she'd discovered that wasn't true. Her talent hadn't disappeared, it had matured, deepened by experience and hardship. The music she played now carried weight it never could have when she was younger, precisely because of everything she'd endured. When her shift finally ended near midnight, Sarah sat alone in the employee lounge, still processing the evening. Jennifer knocked softly and entered with a cup of tea. "That was incredible," Jennifer said, sitting beside her. "I hope I didn't overstep by mentioning you played. I was so tired of that pompous man acting like he was the only person in the room who mattered." Sarah smiled and squeezed her hand. "You gave me a gift tonight. I didn't realize how much I needed to remember who I used to be. Who I still am, underneath everything else." Over the following weeks, Sarah's life began to shift in ways she never anticipated. She started teaching piano lessons 3 afternoons a week, her schedule filling quickly through word-of-mouth recommendations. The income wasn't huge, but it supplemented her event work and, more importantly, it reconnected her with her passion in a sustainable way. She performed at the gallery opening, then at a small concert series at the Community Arts Center. The audiences were modest, nothing like the packed halls she'd once imagined, but they were genuine. People came to hear her play, and they left moved by what they experienced. Emma was her biggest fan, sitting in the front row at every performance, her face glowing with pride. "See, Mommy," she said after one recital. "I knew you were special." Sarah pulled her daughter close, tears pricking her eyes. "We're both special, sweetheart. And we're going to be okay." 3 months after that fateful evening at Riverside Manor, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was Marcus Beaumont. After an awkward pause, he explained that he'd been asked to recommend performers for a prestigious music festival in Charleston next summer, a platform for emerging and returning artists. He wanted to nominate her. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice lacking its usual pretension. "I made assumptions based on circumstances I knew nothing about. Your performance that night, it reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place, before I became cynical. If you're willing to accept the nomination, I'd be honored to write a recommendation." Sarah thought about declining out of pride, but she'd learned something important that night at the piano. It wasn't about proving anything to people like Marcus. It was about staying true to herself, pursuing her passion not in spite of being a single mother, but because of the strength that identity had given her. "I accept," she said. "Thank you." As she hung up the phone, Sarah looked around her small apartment, the same cramped space where she'd felt trapped for so many years. But it didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a starting point. Her story wasn't what she'd planned when she was 18 and full of dreams. She wasn't a concert pianist traveling the world, wasn't recording albums or winning prestigious awards. But she was something better, a survivor who'd maintained her dignity through impossible circumstances, a mother who was teaching her daughter that setbacks don't define you, and an artist who'd discovered that true talent doesn't disappear just because life gets hard. The wealthy guests at that gala had seen her as invisible, as someone beneath their notice. Marcus Beaumont had seen her as entertainment, someone to mock. But Sarah had proven something that night, not to them, but to herself. She'd proven that dignity isn't about circumstances, it's about how you show up in the world. Talent isn't about opportunity, it's about the fire that burns inside you even when the world tries to extinguish it. There would still be struggles ahead. Single motherhood didn't get easier because she'd had one magical evening. Bills would still be tight, babysitters would still be expensive, and she'd still have to make difficult choices about time and resources. But now she moved through those challenges differently, with the knowledge that she hadn't lost herself in the process of surviving. She'd simply been waiting for the right moment to remember who she was. For anyone watching Sarah's journey, her message was clear and powerful. Don't let anyone else define your worth. The world is full of Marcus Beaumonts, people who project their own insecurities and limitations onto others to feel powerful. But true power comes from staying connected to your authentic self, from refusing to let circumstances or critics convince you that your dreams are dead just because they've been deferred. Sarah sits at her piano now, Emma curled up on the couch doing homework while Sarah practices. The apartment is still small, the piano is still secondhand, and tomorrow she'll still have to work a double shift at the manor. But when her fingers touch those keys, none of that matters. She's exactly where she needs to be, not despite her journey, but because of it. What about you? What dream have you set aside because life got complicated? What talent have you buried because someone told you it wasn't practical? Sarah's story reminds us that it's never too late to reclaim what's yours. Your circumstances don't define your worth, and the judgment of others doesn't determine your value. Don't wait for your own Marcus Beaumont moment to rediscover yourself. Take that step forward now. Your gifts aren't gone, they're just waiting for you to remember they exist. If Sarah's story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've been holding back, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe for more stories of resilience, of single mothers who refuse to be defined by their struggles, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the world tries to count them out. Your story could be next. And it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to reclaim their own dreams.